So Sally, I know you've just returned recently from Turkey, and I want you to tell us briefly about your sabbatical, just kind of in the beginning. Why was going to Turkey important to you? What was it that you were trying to learn?
First, I want to thank you for the opportunities. We are blessed to have this opportunity, and we hope we bring blessings back to you because of our experiences and the learning that we receive. So thank you for that opportunity. You know, reading the newspapers before I went on sabbatical, I could see that our church culture was slipping away. We don't have favored status anymore. And I thought, so what does that mean to us? Where are we going to spend our energies? Are we going to spend our energies trying to get the culture back? Or do we spend our energies trying to learn how we are followers of Jesus when we're not the favored status anymore? We don't have that anymore. So I decided to research the early church. How did they survive in an unchurched culture and grow in an unchurched culture? And to be honest, I really wanted to go to Greece. But the door to Greece didn't open and the door to Turkey did. And I got to do the 7 churches of Revelation. Went to every one of those sites, walked those grounds, and it really made it come alive to me. And those chapters in Revelation have meaning to me now. Before a lot of it, words I didn't understand. And today I get it. I get it. And that was because of the tour. So thank you for that opportunity.
All right, you mentioned that our culture really is shifting. Now, you're a native Houstonian. Mm-hmm. You've lived and worked here almost all of your life. Mm-hmm. And you've seen the culture here in Houston begin to shift. Can you elaborate on that just a little bit?
When I was growing up in Houston, we did have favored status. Blue laws were still in existence. You know, you couldn't go anywhere to buy anything on a Sunday. It wasn't allowed. Sunday was a holy day. It was a special day. Nobody planned anything, not only on Sundays. They didn't schedule anything on Wednesday nights either. There were no Little League practices on Wednesday night. There were no school activities on Wednesday night. You just didn't do it. It wasn't done. Has that changed? That's just an example of how different the world has shifted here. When my husband first started working at Continental Airlines, he could always get off at noon if he had perfect attendance, and he always did. He could always get off at noon on holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas. He could always get off so he could have the rest of the day with family. Until about 8 or 9 years ago, when they started running full schedules on Thanksgiving and Christmas. Why? Because we had a city full of people who weren't celebrating those holidays because they didn't mean anything to them.
Will Herberg was a Jewish sociologist, and he wrote a rather extensive paper that was published as a book called Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. And one of the things he talks about is that there was a time back during the first part of the last century all the way up through about the mid-60s when religion, particularly the Judeo-Christian faith, were central in our society. There was a very church-friendly culture, as you've described, and that's fading away. Now, the culture in America is not as radically unfriendly toward the church as the first century Greek, Roman, and Jewish culture was, but there's a lot that we could learn from that. So let's talk about the growth of the early church, because I think that's a critical background for us. We need to know and understand not just the culture in which the early church existed, but the fact that the early church thrived in a very hostile culture. Dr. Rodney Stark is a professor of sociology, distinguished professor of sociology at Baylor University. He's head of their Institute for Religious Studies. He's written a number of books, one of the latest of which is The Rise of Christianity. And Dr. Stark says that Christianity grew at a rate of 40% per decade for its first 300 years. Now, he uses extra biblical sources. He starts with the year 40 AD, and he says, starting with 1,000 Christians. Now, we read the book of Acts, and we see in the book of Acts, which probably took place around 30 AD, somewhere along in there, that 3,000 were added to the church in one day. And the church continued to grow significantly, but he starts with a number of 1,000 in the year 40. And notice the percentage of population as it slowly increases every 50 years. Now it's growing exponentially, and you get to this point, about 250, where it's under 2% of the population, but because it's growing exponentially, because it's basically doubling every few years, you get 10% by the year 3000 or 300 by 350, 56.5% of the population, a population of about 60 million, he estimates, were followers of Christ. That is an absolutely phenomenal period of growth. Essentially unparalleled in the history of the church since then, except in some areas of the world where it's growing. Now, that's the background. The church grew at that significant rate. But what about the culture? What was it like? And so we're going to start in Ephesus. I realized Ephesus was the last place that you all went on your tour, but it's the first place mentioned in the book of Revelation. So I want you to tell us a little bit about your experience there in Ephesus.
Ephesus is the most excavated of all the 7 cities, and so we could imagine walking those streets with Paul and with the Apostle John a little easier than we could some of the others. But the library, one of the second largest library in the world, very educated city, the largest temple to Artemis or Diana was there. Interesting to see now it's just a few dozen crumbled stones. It was an amazing place. We got to see the theater where Paul proclaimed the gospel. It was awesome to see. But then we also got to see the agora, the market, where Christians couldn't shop, and experience what a little bit thinking about what that could be like.
So what was the church like then? What's the significant thing or things that happened in Ephesus?
You know, one of the things that the scripture tells us is that Jesus says, I know your works. I know your good works. And the good works of the early church got attention. They rescued abandoned babies. It was very common, if they didn't want the baby, they just abandoned it in the street. Just leave it out to die. And the Christians would come along and pick up this baby and take this baby home and raise this child as their own. Of course, the child is being discipled at the appropriate age, baptized. You know, church growth happened some because of their adoption. They just brought in the babies. They ministered to the least of these, the poor. One early writer said that poverty in the early church was eliminated. Within the church, there was no poverty because they took care of each other. Wow. And that got attention. That got attention. The Emperor Julian came along in 360 AD, and he goes, you know, these Galileans, they're just not feeding their poor, they're feeding ours too. It got attention, even at the highest levels. Ministry. And you know, I just read yesterday on Facebook a quote about how church planting movements happened across the centuries by taking ministry to the least of these, to the poor. And this was our first example, the early church.
Dr. Rodney Stark really validates that in his book, Cities of God, as he talks about the early church. And let me just read this quote. The power of Christianity lay not in its promise of other worldly compensations for suffering in this life, as has so often been proposed. No, the crucial change that took place in the 3rd century was the rapidly spreading awareness of a faith that delivered potent antidotes to life's miseries here and now. The truly revolutionary aspect of Christianity lay in moral imperatives such as love one's neighbor as oneself and do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And it's more blessed to give than to receive. And when you did it to the least of my brethren, you did it unto me. He says these were not just slogans. Members did nurse the sick, even during epidemics. They did support orphans and widows and the elderly and the poor. They did concern themselves with lots of slaves. And it was these responses to the long-standing misery of life in antiquity that were the material changes that inspired Christian growth.
You know, in the culture, they didn't have the opportunity to do what we could do. They couldn't go into schools. They couldn't bring children to them to tutor, to mentor. They couldn't have block parties. They couldn't do a lot of the things that we do that we consider ministry or evangelism. But the one place they were welcomed was the poor.
To me, that's why ministries like our Mission Centers of Houston and the work that we did last year in Loving Houston, where we went into underserved, under-resourced communities in the name of Christ, and we did just common, ordinary things. Clean up yards, paint houses, put on roofs, patch windows and doors. Doing that in the name of Christ actually created a lot of interest because people would then come up and say, who are you and why are you doing this? And we would have a chance to share the gospel with them. And I think that's one of the reasons we have emphasized for years the importance of the externally focused church. We tend to think what we do inside the walls is the most important thing, but it may be that what we do outside the walls is going to be one of the most important things that we can do. So there was a lot that you learned from Ephesus.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, let's move on. Let's go to Thyatira. Tell me, what's the story there?
Thyatira is a city of craftsmen. And to be a craftsman, you had to join the guild. Now, the guilds were like our labor unions. And you could not be a craftsman unless you were a member of the guild. No problem. Until they held a guild meeting. And when they held a guild meeting, the guild meetings were usually held at the temples. And Thyatira had a lot of them. And they were held at the temples of the pagan gods. Okay, so you just go. No, you can't. Well, number one, you can't opt out. Because if you do opt out, the gods might be displeased and the economy of the city might falter. So you can't opt out. Okay, I'll just go. I'll just go and sit. No, if you go and just sit and do not toast the god might be displeased and might curse our efforts. So to be a member of the guild, you had to go to the guild meetings and you had to participate in the worship of the idols in the temples. Well, that pretty much eliminated being a craftsman in Thyatira. But that pretty much eliminated most of your job opportunities in Thyatira. This was important for me because we have some jobs today that are being taken to court by choices they're making on their Christian beliefs. And I'm going, well, what? Maybe we're covered by the blood. Maybe it's the culture. We have to. Well, they didn't. They didn't. And Jezebel, mentioned in the letter, said, oh yeah, you can, because you're covered by the blood. And Jesus goes, no. The early church, there were many occupations they chose. They weren't school teachers because they would have to teach the pagan gods in the schools. So they weren't school teachers. They weren't artists or sculptors, because who were they going to have to sculpt? And who were they going to have to draw paintings of? They didn't go to plays. They didn't go to dramas, because the gods were portrayed and worshipped. There were some areas that you had to drop incense into the incense burner to the god before you could even walk into the shopping area, what we would call the mall, the agora. So where are you going to go buy things if you can't eat, if you have to worship to the god? I didn't realize how religious they were. Oh my gosh, it permeated every part of their lives, every part of their world. And so now the Christians are over here. How are they going to feed their families? It was a struggle. No wonder they had to take care of one another. There was nobody else that was going to come in and take care of them. It was hard.
So the culture very definitely not only did not support, but was openly hostile and antagonistic toward.
Oh, Christians were seen as social misfits. They were seen as atheists. You see, Rome would let anyone come in and bring their god into their little group. As long as you had Apollo, you had Zeus. I mean, even Ephesus, the temple to Artemis was also the temple to Diana. They were one and the same. Diana was Greek. Artemis was Middle Eastern. So they brought them in. We can do this, You just bring your god to our group and be sure and hail Caesar and everybody's happy. And they said, no, we can't do that. And they were considered very arrogant because they had their god and he was the only god and he was an invisible god, and they thought these people were crazy. Absolutely crazy. Now the Jews came along and they finally got an agreement with Rome. We're loyal, we pay our taxes, leave us alone, we'll be supportive, we won't say Hail Caesar. And they got that agreement. And for a while the Christians came under the Jewish covenant there. But then the Jews got unhappy with them and wrote their names off the book. You notice in one of the letters, Jesus says, I won't write your name off the book. That's what he's talking about. Because the Jews crossed their names off the book, and now they're vulnerable. Now they're vulnerable. Their life is at risk because they're not covered under that covenant that the Jews had with Rome. And they were reviled, just reviled. And their deaths in the arena were cheered. Just cheered. They just thought that the greatest entertainment.
Let's move to today, because what we are seeing is a significant cultural shift. It's happened slowly, it's happened gradually, but it's happening. The slide reflects kind of the then and now, the then side. I grew up going to school, and we would pledge allegiance to the flag, and we would pray, and that's how we began our class every day. And when I went home in the afternoon, we'd watch Leave It to Beaver. And, that world is fading. It's going away. And we liked that world because it was a world that reinforced our beliefs and our values as Christians. The Judeo-Christian value and ethic was reinforced. It supported it. It made it easy to be a Christian in that kind of environment. But we can no longer count on culture to support our beliefs and our values.
It wasn't if you went to church, it's where.
Yeah.
That was the question, where?
And you couldn't run for office unless you were clear about primarily being Protestant up until the election of John F. Kennedy.
They told Dwight Eisenhower before he ran for president that he had to join a church because he could not get elected if he wasn't a church member. And that's when Dwight Eisenhower joined a church.
Pretty different than today's world, where now the emphasis is on pluralism and everyone is the same as everyone else. It's a very, very different culture. Now, we tend to think of this as a bad thing because culture doesn't reinforce what we believe. And I really wish we could suspend that judgment and simply accept the fact that this is the culture that is emerging and the context in which we live. Once upon a time, about 313, Constantine finally became the emperor, and he made Christianity, which had been a countercultural religion for 300 years, he made Christianity a legal religion. And when he made Christianity a legal religion, he gave property back to some of the churches. He built churches. He called the Council of Nicaea. He promoted Christians to high office. We thought that was great. But what happened is that stopped the exponential growth of the church because now government and Christianity were beginning to mesh. And we thought it was a good thing. It turned out historically now not to have been a good thing because then the church began to move from movement exponential growth to more empire thinking. Well, today we live in a context where we have had that for a long time, and now we're moving back to a culture that is less church friendly, and we want to think that's a bad thing, and I'm saying suspend judgment because that may be one of the better things that happens to us.
Yeah.
Because lights shine bright in the darkness. Now, Sally, as we were talking about this, one of the things that you brought up was the difference between harassment and persecution. Because we tend to think, oh, well, there are laws that could be changing. We could be losing our tax-free status. Contributions may no longer be deductible expenses someday. And we're finding it harder and harder to build churches. And so we tend to think that we're being persecuted. But you came from a place where the church really was persecuted. You work in Russia. You distinguish between harassment and persecution. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I have to remind us that we still have the freedom to sit here. I just heard this morning that when I supervise a missionary in Zavolzhia, it's part of my responsibilities with IMB, and he told me that before they came back stateside, as he was worshiping in the church in Gordetz, that an armed policeman sat on the back row of the church service, and he said he wasn't there of his own volition. This was an assignment. We have armed policemen in our service too, but it's there for our protection because of some of the things that have happened in churches. But he was there on assignment, watching the church. The laws were coming down of what the church could and couldn't do about 5 or 6 years ago, and we were hosting 7 pastors, and all of them had started in Siberia. They were now all over Russia, but they'd all started in Siberia. And they were being barred from prisons and schools and all these places, and there were rules of what they could teach children and where they could speak and preach. And over here, we were all in a panic. Oh, they're losing their rights. Oh, we're comparing their culture to ours. And so I asked them about it, and they said, well, if they send us back to prison, we get our prison ministry back. And where's the worst they can send us? Home? Well, the gulags were all in Siberia. Where's the worst they can send us? Home? What a different worldview. We were all panicked, and they were embracing it. Okay, how does Jesus want to use us here? How does Jesus want to use us like this? They weren't worried about the changes. They just were concerned about following Jesus and what he wanted them to do in those situations. Different worldview.
It is. And I think it begs a very difficult question that the church is going to have to answer. And that is, do we want to spend our time trying to revert culture back to a church-friendly 1950s, 1960s kind of culture? Is that where we want to spend our energy? Or do we want to spend our energy trying to figure out how to be a church in an unchurched culture and how to be distinctively different and how to make the gospel attractive? Well, let's move on. Let's go to Smyrna. Tell us a little bit about Smyrna, the city, the church, and what happened there, because this really does take us a little bit further in this direction. Because in Smyrna, it wasn't just about harassment and persecution, but that persecution became martyrdom, didn't it?
Well, it did. It did everywhere. In 35 years, 35 years after Jesus' ascension, if you signed up to be a Christian, you knew you were courting martyrdom. Within 35 years, you knew that signing up as a believer was pretty much putting your name on your death warrant. That the chances of you being martyred were very, very high. And they knew that. They knew that going in. This is one of the pieces that I think I struggled with the most. Because we love life so much. We are pro-life. And we're pro-life in many ways, through many avenues. And part of that is the preservation of life. And yet they knew when they signed up, they knew how they were going to die, and they knew they were going to die, and okay. It was almost freeing for them. It almost gave them freedom. I still struggle with that. We still have persecution here because other cultures have brought it with them. Honor killings happen in the United States. It's just called domestic violence on the police reports. So we don't know. We have no idea how many. We've had Muslim background believers whose lives have been threatened. We've had to move them out of apartments in the middle of the night. We've had family come over and beat them up in Starbucks parking lots so severely they had to go to the emergency room. It's here. We don't hear about it. We don't see it in the newspapers, but it is here. And as Americans, we're going, no, that can't happen here. But it is. It is. And I think for me, this was part of my struggle because going, martyrdom? Martyrdom, really? No. No. I'm in America. I'm not called to that. But yet martyrdom is what drew attention to the early church and how they died. It wasn't that they died, it's how they died. Polycarp was a bishop in Smyrna. Wow, amazing man. History holds out that he was discipled by the Apostle John. So he's one of the last connects to the disciples in that era. And an emperor came up, and it ebbed and flowed. There were some emperors that had other fish to fry and just kind of left them alone. But other emperors would come along, and like Nero, and they were the scapegoat for all the troubles. So Polycarp has been bishop of Smyrna. He is now in his mid to late 80s, and there's a persecution coming down, and it's swear your allegiance, worship Caesar, or we're gonna put you to death. And he wouldn't do it. And the governor and the members of his church wouldn't either. I mean, they hauled them all in. When they came to get Polycarp, he fed his arresting officers a meal before he let them arrest them. He said, no, we can't go until I feed you and show you hospitality. How many of us would be doing that? So the governor sees his advanced age and begs him, please, just, because they didn't care if you truly worshiped Caesar, they just wanted you to say the words. It was all about appearances and unity. So say the words, we'll leave you alone, you can go back and pastor your church. No, I can't do that. I've served my Savior all my life. I can't do that. So they're going to burn him at the stake with the rest of his church. They've got them in the arena. They've got everything ready and going. And they're going to nail his hands to the stake so he can't run away. And he goes, I'm not running away. Just tie me. I'll be fine. So they did. And they set the fire. And the witnesses said it was like a wind. And it kept blowing the fire away from Polycarp. Like a sail on a ship. It would just blow away. The flames wouldn't touch him. The guard in charge finally got so frustrated, he told one of the soldiers just to run him through with the sword, and he did. Well, that's an easier death than being burned at the stake, I think. But the rest of his church, they said they were murmuring. There was no panic. There was no sign of pain. He said either their souls had already left their body or Jesus was walking with them and ministering to them through this. It's how they died. It was their attitude, their peace. They knew where they were going and they embraced where they were going.
Polycarp's story is a story of miracles and martyrdom, and the truth is we probably are real uncomfortable with martyrdom, and coming out of a scientific worldview, probably not overly comfortable with the whole concept of miracles and the way God did what he did. But it is a reminder that even though we're removed by 2,000 years, our world is still experiencing persecution. Christians in our world are still experiencing persecution. Interestingly, Newsweek magazine just a couple of years ago did a feature story on the war on Christians. And the map that you see up in the corner, the dark spots are the places in the world where Christians are experiencing persecution and martyrdom. We would think that persecution and martyrdom would make Christians hesitant to share their faith and that it would hurt the church. And yet, if you look at the map, the areas where the church is being most heavily persecuted are also the areas where we see church planting movements happening. And
just like the early church. Just
like the early church. David Garrison has documented it. You can read about it in his book, Church Planting Movements, and other books that he's written. So to me, this is one of the most remarkable things. And it says to us, okay, things aren't easy. That's not always, it doesn't feel good. But from the church's standpoint, it may be good because we have experienced this loss of growth and denominational decline, and yet while none of us want persecution, that may be one of the things that will be important for separating the wheat from the shaft and getting us back to a much more authentic faith. It's a scary thought, but it's a real thought. Now, Philadelphia. That's the final city that we're going to talk about. You went to all of the 7 churches, but we're going to talk about Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, because they were the church of the open door. They were a church that had phenomenal opportunity, right?
Yep.
Tell us about Philadelphia.
Well, the thing about the early church, they still spoke about Jesus. You could not stop them from talking about it. Now, I would think here, if we knew that we'd be hauled off to prison and taken to the death row, how many of us would just be out blatantly telling people, we would tend to be a little more reserved and quiet, and maybe hide our Bibles a little bit, not display them so openly as we're walking up and down the street. But they talked about their Jesus. They saw what Jesus did in their lives, and you couldn't stop them from telling people about that. And it's all they knew. They didn't have the scriptures we had. They might have access to one of Paul's letters, but they didn't have what we had. And yet they experienced Jesus in their lives in such amazing ways, you could not stop them from talking. They shared. And it's all they knew. Their own experience with Jesus is all they knew to share. Nobody taught them the Roman road. Nobody taught them an evangelism program. Nobody had a 16-week EE or CWT class. They didn't have little tracts. All they had was their own experience with Jesus. And that's what they shared with everyone they could.
If you look at our Southern Baptist records, what you see are articles like this: Southern Baptist Convention membership declined for the 7th year. If you look at our baptisms, we peaked some time ago, about 1992. We've been in decline for a long, long period of time. If you look at our history, 1948, Southern Baptist Convention baptized about 315,000 people. 1923, we baptized 310,000. Now, the U.S. population had grown by 168 million. Our membership had grown by 9.7 million in that same time frame. And yet, we're baptizing the same number we did in 1948. The great temptation is for us to blame the culture. The great temptation is for us to say, well, it's a different world, and people aren't as friendly toward the church, and people don't want to accept you into their homes. We keep wanting to put the blame out there. I think what we're trying to say is the early church was in an even more difficult environment than we are. And yet they grew exponentially. And so the likelihood is that the problem isn't out there. What was it Pogo said? We've met the enemy and
He is us.
He is us. I think there is a change that needs to take place. But I think we're better served by trying to change within than trying to change the culture without. Mm-hmm. Sally, let's just let you kind of summarize. What are the things that you want us to know?
I think first we need to understand persecution. We need to, we know what's going on overseas, but it doesn't affect us. We go, oh yeah, oh that's bad. But those are our brothers and sisters in Christ. And we are treating them like strangers. I don't know what all the answers are, because we, as the church, have not looked into it enough. But we need to. We need to. And to be honest, some of them don't want to be rescued from their persecution or martyrdom. They ask us to pray that they will be the light of Jesus in the middle of it. Mm. Ouch. Does that not shame us? We think everybody should have the same Christianity we have, and I'm not sure we should wish that on them. So we need to understand persecution. We need to understand the difference between harassment and persecution. And we need to know how to support our persecuted brothers and sisters. We need to understand what our biblical choices in our culture, not necessarily our constitutional choices. Now, I'm an American, and I'm proud that I've never missed an election. Never. I vote, and I will continue to vote. I'll sign petitions. Although talking about changing culture, did y'all know that the petitions that were signed to get the new City of Houston measure on the ballot were posted online so anyone could see who signed those petitions? And it was legal. It's public information. But if you sign that petition, your name and address is now online as a signer of that petition. New day, new world. Yeah. So yeah, I'll sign my petitions. I'll vote. But am I ready to go picket? Maybe that's not the best use of my time. Am I ready to go protest? Maybe that's not the best use of my time. Maybe the best use of my time is to getting together with my brothers and sisters and praying. Because that's where the real change comes from. Maybe prayer. And change comes from within. So maybe I need to be spilling Jesus on more people. You know? So that they become followers of Him and change their value system based on the Bible as opposed to what I tell them is right and wrong. So evangelism in this new culture, what does that look like? I think in today's world, our story is more important than anything else we can give. And that assumes we have one. People don't want to hear how I was saved and baptized at 8. They want to hear how God worked in my life this week. They want to hear how God worked in my life in a situation that's similar to theirs. So how do we get our folks to where they are at a point where they have an intimate walk with God? So much that you can't stop them from talking about it. That it just bubbles up and spills over on people. In their ministry, in their love. Why is the world coming up with random acts of kindness? Why didn't the church come up with that? It shouldn't have been the Church of Oprah. It should have been the Church of Houston that came up with that. Where are we? We're behind the times. Let's reach out. Let's be so full. Are our people so full of the love of Jesus that it just overflows? How do we disciple them to that? That's our evangelism challenge. How do we disciple them to that? How do we get them there? Ministry to the least of these. Yes, we should be taking care of our own. The church saw that the early culture saw that. They saw that poverty was eliminated within the church. But the Emperor Julian also said, but they feed our poor too. And you know, it was the early criminals that just came to faith in Christ in numbers because they were so relieved to get the forgiveness that He offered, that the pagan temples would not offer. We're seeing that today in prisons. There is an amazing revival going on in TDCJ prisons today. Amazing. We want to shine the light as long as God leaves that door open. Because they know. They know who they were and what they've been. And that Jesus has come in and forgiven them. Whoa, they're clean. They're clean. They may still be in prison, but they're free. And they know it. So who are the least of these? Who are we supposed to be out there ministering to and feeding and rescuing? You know, the early church had unity. They didn't have denominations. There weren't enough of them. They couldn't fight over little bitty differences. All they could do was support one another while they were being taken to the lions or to be candles for Nero's dinners. So they supported one another. They loved one another. They wrote letters of support to one another. We've kind of got to get over our differences. And here in Houston, I got to say, we probably do it better than almost any other city in the country. We do. We do. But we're not there yet. And we've got to step up our game. I had a Chinese student in my home for dinner a couple of years ago, and he said, "What are the differences between all the Christian faiths?" And thank you, Holy Spirit. I said, it'd be easier if I just told you what we had in common. But I went straight from creation to Christ, and we have all that in common. Why do we have to fight over this when we have all this in common? There's bigger fish to fry than arguing over little bitty differences. Let's have unity. And how do we do that? How do we support our other brothers and sisters? We need to pray and be respectful of our government. In spite of the fact that the government was killing them, they paid their taxes and they prayed for Caesar. Even though they knew that he was going to kill them. They paid their taxes, they obeyed the laws, and they prayed for Caesar. I got to tell you, I see some really nasty things about our government and our leaders on Facebook. And I'm not sure that's what we're called to do. I'm just not sure that's what we're called to do. We are called to pray for our leaders. Because even in an environment like Rome, Paul said, you pray for them. God put them here for a purpose. And we need to do that. Those are my take-homes.
Sally, thank you.